Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a real favorite. Oh yeah. So these are stone trolls. hmm These are the iconic stone trolls back from the 90s. This one in particular was designed by Michael Perry. To my mind, these were always the perfect mix of that kind of brutality and comedy. And this model takes me way back. It's the kind of model that you're likely to find in almost everybody's collection, regardless of whether or not they were playing Orcs and Goblins or not. Yeah, most of the time you would find them in Orcs and Goblins armies, but to be perfectly honest, they were so well loved that you would see them almost everywhere. So these models, there were a whole bunch of designs of these, and in fact, they were released in two batches. The original batch, I think, had mostly hand weapons and great weapons. The later ones had all manner of rocks and bones and bits and bobs. And of course, these then led to the other equally iconic river trolls that everybody loves as well. So yeah, these are among my favorite models and definitely a must-have in almost anybody who's serious about this kind of thing. Anybody's collection who's serious in this kind of thing. So one thing I found really interesting about this model was that he had a little eyeball sculpted actually onto this. Well, not eyeball. The pupil was sculpted onto the eyeball, and to be honest, I didn't really like that. I kind of want to have a little bit of leeway to give him a smaller pupil, which kind of sort of makes him look a little bit more mean. That giant pupil was a little bit too much for me, so I took that off with a knife. We're going to jump right in and put a bit of Iandan yellow on it straight away, so you can sort of see how large this eyeball is immediately, and you can sort of try to understand why I took such a drastic step to alter a model. Generally speaking, I don't like altering classic miniatures simply because I kind of feel that there was a vision behind it, but that weird, derpy little pupil sculpted onto that eyeball was a little bit beyond me. And yeah, having the ability to sort of direct the gaze of the viewer on a part of the model that's as important as an eyeball, I wanted to retain that for myself. Now, this guy is going to be mostly blue, as is the iconic old artwork, but I think the new the current range of contrast paints has a few interesting colors, which I think will help make this model stand out a little bit more on the tabletop. Um, it's going to surprise everyone, well, some of you anyway, who are not familiar with my style, that I'm actually going to be starting with Flesh. Yeah. So as much as this guy is going to be a primarily blue miniature overall, like he's going to read as a blue miniature from afar, I like to actually work in a bit of warm colors somewhere into the miniature. So beginning with Flesh is a really good way for me to start. I feel putting a bit of warmth and life into the miniature. Now, I mean, I think we're kind of conditioned to understand what flesh tones look like broadly. I mean, of course, there are regional variations depending on where you live in the world, but I think mostly we understand that flesh has a kind of range of tones that we would normally gravitate towards. So, with that in mind, even if you're painting an inhuman creature like an orc or a troll or similar, right? I think what happens is our eyes naturally gravitate towards anything that can be read as an organic kind of analog to our own kind of flesh tones. So anything that's that kind of like uh, range from like pinky flesh tones to something slightly darker, that naturally is where our eyes gravitate towards. And I think on a miniature like this, it can be very tempting to do nothing but blue, right? Maybe varying, a few tones of dark and light blue. But I think that kind of loses the essential organic characteristic of this miniature, and that makes it look a little bit more like an elemental thing or kind of like a construct of some kind. And if that's your approach, that can work certainly. I think that looks visually quite cool as well. If you're trying to make the troll seem a lot more inhuman, maybe if you've got a lot of flesh tones already in your army, maybe if you've chosen not to do, the orcs in such a lurid shade of green, maybe it can be a strategy to make your trolls more inorganic looking. But I think it works well to have something for us to latch to with our animal brains, our instinctive understanding of what a living creature might look like. So these fleshy marks on the models, I would choose to put them in the ears. Any part that I suppose would be sort of soft and vulnerable in real life. On a human, like ears, like maybe even the tip of his nose. We can do a little bit of under glazing here, and of course, because this flesh tone is relatively light, and we're going to be blending this in with bluer tones over the top. I don't think this goes on then to define the overall way that the model reads. I think it just serves to add a little bit of interest into the overall look of the miniature. The color that I've chosen to depict most of the blue areas, or to work in all of the blue areas I've selected today, will be Ultramarines blue, which I think is the right shade of desaturated blue to follow the early artwork which I'm trying to emulate. And then to blend them in between, I'm going to use a much weaker contrast paint, weaker as in more translucent. I'm going to be using a little bit of Gryphhound Grey to blend in between the fleshy areas, as well as with the the sort of darker shade of the Ultramarines blue. So then we've got a nice gradation between the soft, I guess more vulnerable looking tissues, and the kind of hard, scaly bits, which characterize most of his back sort of craggly texture. I think we'll achieve quite a nice range of tones. And then the rest of the parts of the model, I think we just keep in fairly naturalistic tones. Nothing really to sort of jump out to steal attention from the flesh tone, which is really the hero of this miniature, right? We'll have to think about what we want to do the loincloth in as well. But yeah, okay, so this is how I've chosen to start. May look a little bit strange now, but please bear with me. So the next thing I'm going to go into is Ultramarines blue, I think, straight away, to cover the largest areas of craggly texture on the model. This I will probably go on to shade with Gryphhound Grey, so that it then blends together with the flesh correctly. As you can see, a bit strong. Perhaps needs a bit of dilution. So let me grab a touch of contrast medium. Now you can use actual contrast medium, or you can mix your own from like matte medium and a little bit of flow enhancer. The Vallejo one is particularly decent. But yeah, mix this in, and we should be getting a little bit more subtlety between the two once gravity has done its thing and leveled out the paint a bit on the surface. There you go. So you get to see a little bit more of the texture. The one that splotch on the right just now, which I've now gone over again, was a little bit too strong, and I felt it kind of killed any subtlety that we had going on the surface. This is my preferred style of painting. I'm beginning to think that it isn't universal to people that I've spoken to. A lot of people have pointed out that I use contrast paints in a way that they did not expect. This surprised me a little bit, to be honest, because I thought people were already controlling the intensity of contrast paint. But it seems that's not necessarily universal, and that's okay, right? Because it's really what's within our limit of experience and what we enjoy using. But controlling the intensity of contrast paint really gives you power back into your hands to decide which areas need to be a little bit more intense and which areas can be a little bit weaker. And as is often my way, it also allows me to cut back a little bit on highlighting, which can kind of take a long time. It's still essential to finish a model to a show standard, but because we're kind of just aiming for a high tabletop standard for now, something that will look good on the table, something that we can be proud of using in games, not necessarily striving for any kind of competition standard, which I mean I've done in the past, but right now I think I just want to get my giant pile of grey and lead finished. So yeah, there we go. So yeah, go right ahead and douse this all over the surface. Anywhere you have this craggly skin texture, and the reason why we blocked in the flesh earlier, the flesh tone earlier, is because I think it helps us to sort of define which bits we want to depict as a little bit more organic, and also because the flesh tone would have a hell of a time trying to cover over this much more intense and dark blue tone, it would kind of get lost in the weeds, and that would take a lot of time to reestablish later. So point number one, it helps us plan out exactly which areas look good in that kind of fleshy tone, and it also helps us to control exactly where, or rather how much of it is showing through the other areas on the model, which will be painting blue, without having to go back and forth between the colors too much. Again, another time saving way of approaching this problem. So dropping it in. Oh, right, another thing. Why I chose to do the eye first? Well, I think for this model, the eye is kind of going to be the major focal point. There are a lot of things that makes that works in that eye's favor, right? First of all, it's the fact that it's the one yellow point that I see myself using on the entire miniature. I don't think anything else on this miniature is going to be that lurid, Eandan yellow kind of yellow tone. And I think I will enhance it further by actually highlighting that it is worth the effort. And it's really useful to have that highlighted on the miniature. The other thing is that it's going to be nested on the surface that's primarily blue, so that kind of cold background and warm kind of centerpiece, which I see the eye as a centerpiece in the color scheme, definitely draws attention to it. So it's got everything it needs to jump out from the surface of the miniature right at you. And I think we might as well go all in on that, because that's a very big part of where the humor lies in this miniature. This is a funny looking guy. I don't think anyone would dispute that, and funny in a good way, because stone trolls on the surface are a pretty horrifying concept, and that sort of mix of humor as well as a little bit of serious brutishness. I mean, look at the size of this weapon. It looks like it's going to cause carnage no matter where he swings it, regardless of whether you're a dragon or you're just a poor Reeklander halberdier standing in the front rank, unfortunately, of his unit. And I think it kind of has that balance of humor and violence that Warhammer is so good at depicting. All right, cool. So I have run out of my initial batch of Ultramarines Blue. Let me go grab some more Ultramarines Brew. Don't mind me, slightly tongue-tied today, but there you go. So I'm really glad that the videos that I've been putting up seem to be getting some attention on YouTube, which is wonderful. As you know, a lot of these videos, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but clearly these videos are meant to be watched while you do your own videos, do your own miniatures. And in that sense, they're a little bit unconventional as far as runtime as well as style. They're certainly unscripted, and really it's just an opportunity for me to keep you company while you work on your own projects. And likewise, this actually helps me. This gives me motivation to get my stuff done. My hope is that people join these videos with their own miniatures, and make it a regular thing, so that you can work through your pile of potential or pile of shame, as the case may be. Although shame is we're kind of past shame, aren't we? We don't need this from a hobby. We don't need the guilt trip from something that we're supposed to find pleasurable in life. So yeah, what has painting been for you? I want to know. Painting for me has been one of those experiences in my life that I've never found unpleasant. I think a lot of people have a lot of tension, a lot of stress, I think, when they come to approaching a miniature, because there is ever the fear that you might ruin the miniature somehow by painting it. I've never really had this problem past a certain point in my painting career, mostly because I think very early on I learned that miniatures could be stripped back. Basically, that means you could reset your progress at any time, and you could really, just kind of start again if you felt that the miniature really was going down the wrong path, something that you didn't intend. But the truth is, I rarely exercise this as an option. I think it's a bit extreme, and I find that there are very few paint jobs that cannot be rescued with a little bit of tinkering. And I think part of the reason why I feel this to be the case personally is because this method of paint that I'm using, of painting that I'm using, frankly, applies very, very thin coats on the surface. And we're kind of working with the surface detail rather than potentially covering it up with layer after layer of thick paint, as you might do using, say, like layering as a technique and so on. Even for layering, to be perfectly honest, you're really meant to be working in thin layers so you don't obscure the surface detail. I think a lot of Citadel painting guides and a lot of like guides online, videos that you watch, would advocate that you don't use thick paint. Best example of this would be Duncan Rhodes and his painting academy, right? I love Duncan Rhodes. He does amazing work, and I think he's kind of paved the way for miniature painting to feel a lot more approachable, especially with Games Workshop's increased levels of details on their miniatures these days. And yeah, so he advocates applying paint in two thin coats, no more, no less. Well, more if it needs it, I suppose. Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, as it is, you want to try to achieve a fairly even, balanced layer on the surface with no imperfections and build up of paint unnecessarily. And I think that's really good advice. I definitely incorporated that. I assimilated it into my own strategy, kind of unconsciously actually, because I found that I was watching a lot of his videos as I was working on my own miniatures, and that's really good to have because, as you know, this hobbies. If you're painting your own miniatures, painting assembly, planning your army lists and such. These are gonna be the bulk of the time that you spend in the hobby. The amount of time that you spend actually playing games either comes later or it never really quite exceeds the amount of time preparing your miniatures, because that's just how this hobby is. If you want to get your models to a higher standard by yourself, by hand, it takes a lot of time. So yeah, but anyway, yeah, so keeping the miniature paints thin on the surface so that you don't lose detail, and readability. That's really important. So it's never been a priority for me to come back in and strip a miniature. Usually, if there is an area that I don't like the look of, I just come back in and I block in the undercoat color again, which in my case is a kind of off-white tone. I use a color called Vallejo Silver Gray, which is a really close analog to the spray paint that I use. It matches the spray undercoat that I use, which is this off-white matte gray white from a company called Pylox. It's a rattle can spray, and I find that it creates a really good, slightly desaturated white on the surface, and this really helps me to get a more natural look, and also take the edge of the vibrancy of contrast a little bit. Contrast can be a little bit too vibrant in my opinion. If used just straight out of the bottle over a white undercoat, I find that it can start to look very neon, which depending on what you're painting, it might be the idea. But for models like this troll, for example, definitely I favor a more naturalistic look, something that is a closer analog for real life lighting and shadows, as opposed to something that might appear to emit light. So for example, when I paint flames, or if I were to paint maybe something from Zinch, something that like a horror of Zinch, which would be emitting its own flames as it sort of like cavorts and dances, giggling and screaming, that kind of thing, I would undercoat in white, because I want that little bit more of a kind of candy colored punch from the contrast paint. But for something like a troll, definitely not. Another thing that we're going to be experimenting with is the idea of how you can shade cool colors with warm colors, which, I mean, we've seen it on the Nurgle champion that I did previously, good old Stab the Acolyte. We're going to do it again today. I think we might, depending on how this blue tone, this Ultramarines blue, dries on his skin. We might come in with Devlin Mud to reinforce some of the shadows. Devlin Mud, today it would be called, what is it called these days? Agrax Earthshade, I think. Yeah, so it's a warmer color that you can use to shade in. a colder tone like blue, and I think the play of on the surface looks really interesting. As it is, I'm already fading, the blue on his nose, and I'm going to be showing you how you can blend these in. And to be perfectly honest, if a little bit of the flesh, which is possibly still wet at some spots, blends into the blue, so much the better, because that makes it look a lot more natural. I think the real problem with a miniature like this is that you run the risk of turning it into a two-tone miniature, kind of like a Space Marine, where like the shoulder pad trim is one color and the interior is another color. I think that can look really artificial and kind of weaken the effect rather than improve it. Cool. So I want to, while that's drying, work on his weapon a little bit. So his weapon is a fairly simple device, as you would expect. It is essentially a chunk of stone, and it's got some wrappings onto it and not much else. So for this, I would just go ahead and straight up paint a wash over it rather than, as in I would take the existing color of the undercoat as the base coat, and I'll go right ahead and just shade it in. Perhaps with Nuln Oil, which, as you can tell, I'm clearly having trouble finding on my desk because my desk is a horror show. It's got paints everywhere. Oh goodness, where is it gone? No matter. I think I will reach for a... Let's grab some of the new Citadel Nuln Oil, which is a little bit lighter, but it will suffice for our purposes. Lighter as in more translucent. Yeah. So let's see how that looks on the surface. There is a small amount of metal. These chains that he wears, holding in place that skull on his chest and so on. I think what I'll do with that is I'll shade it with Devlan Mud as well, because I want to tie this model towards. I want to tie the various elements of this model towards by carefully using warm and cold colors on the surface. And I think just doing a straight silver washed in Nuln Oil, which is the really quick way to define silver, I think that's just not going to add enough character to his color scheme. Perhaps what I'll do is I will use Devlan Mud to wash over the silver, thereby giving me a slightly warm tone. I think if there is a bit of a logic to my color choice on this miniature, I think what I'm trying to do is to make sure that anything that's supposed to read as stone stays within that blue sort of cold color scheme. And in this I would consider, Nuln Oil, because it doesn't have any warmth to it out of the bottle. Over this undercoat, I would consider this to be cold as well. And anything that's kind of organic or fleshy, like his ears and all the organic parts that I've picked out on his body, those ones I will want to keep them warm. The wood tone on his weapon haft of his stone axe over here, I'm going to do in a really warm tone as well, so that the whole model becomes a play of cold and warmth. And I think that captures essentially what a stone troll is supposed to be, right? He's this unnatural blend of stone and organic, and an organic creature. So story-wise, in the lore, stone trolls have always been a favorite part of the Warhammer Orcs and Goblins army. They don't really feature in many other armies, despite how ubiquitous they are in the lore. They're not exactly rare creatures, although they tend to frequent, wilderness areas, of course, and places where, the world is a little bit wilder and a little bit more dangerous to explore. So they're a real fixture in Warhammer Quest games. They actually appear in many battle level tables, and they persist for quite a while. Stone trolls are cool because in the lore, they consume stones as their primary diet. Trolls are supposed to be maddeningly dim, right? They're not the brightest of creatures by far. So they also have an insatiable appetite, which they go to town on. And it turns out that when you live on a mountain, the most common thing that you can eat is stone, right? Chunks of rock. And in the Warhammer, and this would be okay, I suppose. This would be really interesting in any other world. In our world, for example, you'd probably develop into something that's akin to a panda, right? A real life panda that eats bamboo and nothing else and kind of becomes slow and sluggish as a result. Or like maybe like a koala, an Australian koala, which would be consuming mostly like eucalyptus leaves, and therefore because their energy source is so nutrient, um, what's the opposite of dense? It's kind of thin on nutrients. You would have a long-lived creature essentially that moves and sort of grows really really slowly, and generally can have a kind of benign aspect to them. So, but in the Warhammer world, of course, being loosely based on our own world, but of course being ever so slightly different, stone trolls have absorbed a lot of the magic that naturally seeps into stone, namely light magic. In the Warhammer world, you've got your 8 winds of magic, right? And each one of them has a color. Later on, these will go on to be the basis for the realms within Age of Sigmar. But each one of these magical realms, or rather, each of these magical winds as they blow over the Warhammer world, coalesces and becomes part of the natural world in some way and tends to naturally collect in some way. So, for example, life magic. Life magic tends to, as the name suggests, get concentrated by rain, and then it will get focused by trees that naturally take in the rain with their roots, and then kind of become an essential part of living things. Hence, law of life is very closely associated to greenery and trees and living creatures of all kinds, woodland creatures in particular, because of the trees concentrating it. There's a similar effect with light magic. It gets collected by stones because it is diffuse and flows around loosely, and it gets concentrated in stones, which of course these blighters go on and eat. And then just like you would have like a tuna fish, kind of like accumulating mercury in its system. Stone trolls go on to accumulate a vast amount of magic within their body. So that's a long-winded way of explaining the lore behind why stone trolls had a tendency to have magic resistance in every version of their rules. They tend to hmm, they tend to have a built-in innate dispel. In Warhammer Quest, this got taken a bit further, right? Because Warhammer Quest, they have the ability to drain magic, which was even more dangerous. They would sap the strength of the winds of magic because they were so absorbent, like magical sponges almost. I've taken out a little bit of Nazdreg yellow because I want to use that for the wrappings on the stick, but I don't think that's dry enough to work on, so I don't have the confidence to do that correctly yet. I'm going to go on to maybe do his, let's just very quickly do the skulls on his chest. Those are large enough in my opinion, and I think they're intended to be actual skulls of creatures that he's killed. They're kind of lumpy and brutish and not very refined looking. So more than likely he's clubbed a couple of dwarves, hasn't he? In fact, I could almost guarantee you that there is a dwarf slayer somewhere out there related to these two unfortunates on his chest, and he's almost certainly coming after him looking for revenge. Perhaps even the demon slayer that we painted previously. He might have graduated to demons, but demons are fairly rare. They don't really always take an interest in mortal affairs, or they have trouble breaking into our realm. So maybe on his long list of grudges, our demon slayer also has one particular troll who might have killed 2 of his kin, and maybe he's already on the way looking for revenge on this poor troll. Right, so I think I'm going to jump in and do the claws as well, although there is a temptation to do the claws in black. I think claws work well in light colors, like bone in particular, because I think they draw the eye to the extremities of limbs, and I think that's a really important way to keep, you know, your eye moving around the body of a troll. You want your eyes to eventually be drawn to the business end of his most dangerous natural weapons, and in this case, he's got these crazy long claws, which are kind of eagle-like almost. I really like the way they look. They're not more dangerous than that club, but you really do get the sense that if he were to lose his club for any reason, he could still maul the heck out of you with those long talons. Really cool element of design. So yeah, stone trolls, rock-eating, magic coalescing, dangerous opponents, quite ubiquitous in mountainous areas where, of course, magical energies tend to accumulate in rocks, of course, and a real nightmare for any wizard to encounter. I'm wondering what color to do his loincloth, in case you're wondering. I've used the mid brown. I think the only choice that we have really is Gorgrunter fur. Always a good pick, and because it's not a big part of the color scheme on this, the fact that it's so intense is probably not going to hurt our color scheme overall. So let's just put it on here, let that dry. That thing is a claw, I realize, a dew claw or a thumb. So I'll be avoiding that little white triangle over there in the bottom left, just in case you're wondering why I didn't touch that. And let's go here. And yep, I think that looks all right. We can differentiate this a little bit more from the surrounding hues by intensity later. But you can sort of see how like overpowering the ultramarines blue is, right? It really is an excessively strong color straight out of the bottle. And what you're seeing here on this miniature is already the color that's been cut with 1:1 contrast medium, and already it's still way too dark. So the irony is, yeah, one might be tempted to say, okay, cool, then you need to go in and highlight it so that, you know, you lift some of the areas out of the darkness. My inclination, however, is to do the exact opposite and go even darker so that the parts which are, you know, not deepened further stand out on their own as a result. Okay, so let's block in some of the metal. The metal here, I think, serves to define. Let me keep him in frame a little bit so you see that chain on the back of his neck. That's what we're going to be painting next. I think the metal on his body is a really good way to sort of help us mentally break apart the different zones on this miniature. So you have it around his neck. So you've got an interesting like sort of path of color moving around his body, leading the eye from one section of it to another, and coming to rest on his chest where you've got both of those skulls. It's a good piece of like storytelling on the miniature, but again, I feel it's not quite as important as that eye. Therefore, we'll be putting a little bit more effort to define that single beady eye, with which he's squinting over at most of at whatever it is that he's looking to club with that gigantic axe. There is a lot of dynamic tension in this pose, insofar as trolls are slow thinkers, right? So this guy is slowly processing his environment, and that's very satisfying to see on the miniature. There's a kind of a thong with a stone over there. I think I'll keep that stone colored. Maybe use it as an interesting point of color. Yeah. Okay, cool. So while we are going through locking in the silver, that definitely needs time to dry fully. So maybe what I'll do is I'll jump in on that eye again. And I feel that painting is a lot quicker if you've got, you know, the right colors on hand as and when you need them. So I'm going to be jumping to some Vallejo Ice Yellow. I guess the equivalent would be Dawn Yellow for the Citadel range. Equally good, as far as I'm concerned. Very similar in terms of their bright values and the fact that they don't desaturate the surface of the model. For example, adding white to a yellow would make it kind of chalky. Using ice yellow makes it less chalky. keeps the saturation going high while making the values brighter. So that helps to sort of keep the model looking vibrant and visually appealing. Right. So now comes the time to do some of the shading. I think what I'll do is I'll grab some of the Gryphcharger gray that I mentioned earlier, and I want to sort of help to blend together the flesh areas and the blue, because like I mentioned earlier, it is looking a little bit like a model composed of two parts, and that's not entirely what we want. So let's apply some Gryphcharger to define, again, kind of like painting as shadows, like a shade over some of these areas. So he's got a few stray like nubbins on his belly, as well as the lower half of his belly gets a little bit of Gryphcharger. Sort of like working this in, feathering it in where needed, and also helping to define some of the shadows. Now where this touches the blue, I think it creates a very pleasing shading level, while not making the troll look quite as vulnerable as it does. The skin tone that I use, my usual mix of Seraphim Sepia and Guilliman Flesh, has a tendency to look a little bit pinky, just the way I like it for human flesh tones, because I think it contrasts well with clothing. But on the troll, it's a little bit too soft and squidgy looking, and therefore we can cut it back with a little bit of this bluish hued Gryphcharger Grey. Gryphcharger Grey, definitely one of the most versatile colors to use for a wide range of users. Definitely one of my favorite colors, and one of the first contrast colors that I picked up because I saw so much potential in this desaturated, slightly neutral blue-gray tone. Okay, I'm liking how that looks. He's definitely looking a little bit more natural now, not so much, as I mentioned earlier, a creature, a color scheme of two parts, which I try to avoid, because naturally you want to try to pull the eye in different directions, right? You want to try to visually, not pull, sorry, that's a bit of a weird way to say it, to try to attract the eye to different parts of the same model, and to do it naturally using warm and cold colors. Sometimes you might create a model that looks kind of jarring. This Gryphcharger definitely helps to blend them together to make them kind of a more naturalistic looking finish without necessarily resorting to too much shading. Let's experiment with a little bit of Devlin mud on his lower back, because you can sort of see that he's got these two long cords of muscles, and you've got the muscles of his upper back. That would benefit from a bit of additional definition and shading. And let's see if we can get away with not using a highlight. Not because I don't think highlighting has its place, more because, well, I think doing it with a shade allows us to add interesting colors into the recesses. So this is Devlin Mud. Nowadays, Agrex's Earthshade would do exactly the same thing, and any number of similar neutral brown tones. Army Painter Strong Tone, for example, would do something very similar, if not exactly the same. So we can work this over the surface, build it up a little bit in the cracks, and kind of give a little bit more mood to what is essentially a very blue, a very cold surface. Yeah. So this reminds us that this is not a chunk of stone. I mean, not that many stones are this bright blue color, but it helps to remind us that this is actually a living organic creature, albeit one that has become what it likes to eat, right? So I think this helps put a bit of grunge and grime into the recesses. It helps us to define the surface. Once the metal is dry enough, I'm going to shade the metal in Devlin Mud as well. I like the idea that whatever metal's on this creature is going to be extremely weathered and dirty. The question of how he's gotten a weapon that at least looks lashed together. I mean, I think this troll trolls famously are stupid, right? So in every edition of the Warhammer rules, they've always, or well, almost every edition, I don't believe they have this problem now on quite the same level, but they've always got some variation of the idea that they're not the brightest creatures in the world, right? So they have a tendency to have to make morale checks or basically take leadership tests in order to determine whether they behave relatively intelligently or whether they just lurch forward stupidly or kind of lose interest in whatever's happening near them or around them. So I don't imagine that weapon was actually put together by a stone troll. Probably this guy was armed by one of the many night goblins that would typically recruit stone trolls into their ranks as powerful line breakers. Even in Blood Bowl, when you've got like trolls, they have a tendency to need other miniatures to kind of goad them into action. Any miniature that doesn't have the really stupid trait, which is what represents this general mental turgidity that trolls have. Trolls are characterized by. Yeah, so being really stupid is a part of the troll kind of design philosophy, the troll kind of concept, which is kind of cool. When we were playing Warhammer in the past, we would always wonder how on earth troll societies survive, or how trolls survive as a species, since they're always like failing their leadership test on 4 and plowing to rocks or piles of rocks. Maybe that's how they eat. Yeah. Okay, cool. So while this chap is drying, I think he's looking pretty good. I'm going to move on to doing his base because I think we need to give the damp spots on the miniature a little bit more time to dry up. So I am going to go straight into Agros Dunes, our usual Agros Dunes color for his base. And I'm going to trigger all of you by doing my usual thing where I drop the paint directly onto the sand. It tends not to be an issue because it absorbs directly in. And Agros Dunes is just the color that I'm using. Really what it is a mix of artists' acrylic inks, because I do really go through a massive amount of this stuff. So I let this wick into the surface by capillary action. Think about how much like Agros Dunes that I used before I started mixing my own color equivalent. I know exactly how much I use, and it's not a good thing. At least 5 to 6 bottles before I realized that I could just mix an equivalent and kind of use it with abandon. The reason why I went ahead and did this was because at some point I would use less paint than was ideal. And once you kind of compromise on your compromise on the finish a little bit, that it's time to explore other methods on account of the cost. So yeah, raw umber, I think raw sienna, I think. I will put this again in the description when I get around to it, so that you know exactly what I use to mimic the color of Agros Dunes. But yeah, this color was originally inspired by Agros Dunes because I found that it was a nice uniform layer that was nice and versatile, could work with almost any surface. And because it's got a little bit of yellow in it, it tends to lift the miniature above it. While, because I never use this as the bulk of any miniature these days, much, not sapping away the intensity of the miniature by just replicating a color from the color scheme directly on the base. Okay, so some interesting things have started to happen. I think I had a little bit of color built up over there. Need to reintroduce that into the recesses, or else maybe jump in with darker color. As you can see, some of the Devlin mud has taken away some of the intensity of the blue in the recesses. I think this is because those areas were still a bit wet. Not to worry. On this channel, we deal with our problems on camera. So when we make mistakes like this, we go right ahead and we work around them. We don't avoid them, we don't edit them out, we show everything. So let's just go back in with a bit of black, because I think Black Templar would have the intensity to fix that issue. You're also seeing me try to reach into this little area. So when this is an issue, when reaching these parts are an issue, I tend to just flip the entire miniature upside down. It just makes it easier for me to reach these bits. Pardon me if it looks a little bit rough on camera, but it won't take too long to fix these areas. Okay, so yep, that's the recesses darkened in again, and I think he looks fine. Let's just take off a little bit of the excess eyebrows deals, and we'll clean it up later around the edge of the base. So we're going to move on to putting in a little bit of the Nazdreg yellow onto the wrappings of his weapon. So that goes onto here, and as you can see, it's kind of like the snakebite leather, but it's a little bit lighter and a little bit more towards the yellow spectrum. So applying this carefully, not letting it pull too much, essentially applying a thinner coat of this stuff would help us visually distinguish these two areas. Plus, we can come in and emphasize the difference with a little bit of a highlight later if we so chose, depending on how it looks when the paint is dry. We can think about how we want to do that. So this goes on fairly quick and easy, and with that, I think the bulk of the undercoat has been covered. I don't think I've left any uncovered undercoat. Well, except for that. Let's do that very quickly. The thong, I assume, is the same material that's on his weapon. Wrappings. There we go. Okay. So he's looking good, if slightly grungy, but I think that's just fine. Now, that metal area. As before, I think a little bit of Devlin mud is the right color to use again for this. So let me fetch that. Where is Devlin mud? It's hiding from me. It's a little puddle that we'll use. Oh, missed a little bit of fabric on his leg. There we go. It's amazing how long this Gryph charger, or rather this what was this again? This was Gorgrunter fur. It's taking to dry. It's surprising, but there you go. All right, so let's grab some Devlin mud and let's run this over the recesses of this chain. Or not. Not quite ready yet. Okay guys, this is one of the few times that I think I might need to take a hairdryer break. Sorry about that. I'll just very quickly pause the recording and then I'll come back in after this is fully dry. Hey guys, we are back. Sorry about that. Sometimes, the model does what the model wants to do, and yeah, a little bit more time is needed for things to come together a little bit. So it's now been a few minutes with a hairdryer, and now the surface is all perfectly dry, ready to take paint, which is great. So moving on from over the top of the metal area, we're going to be putting a little bit of Devlin mud over it just to deepen it, and as you can see, the Devlin mud is now behaving properly, deepening the surface, adding that recessed shade that we really wanted to have earlier on. But of course, the paint had other plans. What are you going to do? So I think that's looking fine now. Personally, I had to pause the recording because I couldn't make you sit through the sound of a hairdryer. It's just an ear burstingly loud noise. Didn't want to put you through that, so I had to pause it for a second. But as you can see, we are carrying on where we left off. So the Devler mud with the paint fully dry is definitely having the correct effect now. I just need to put a little bit more of it into some of the recesses where it was kind of blending a little bit on the surface. Not necessarily in a bad way, but I think it stopped us reaching the levels of saturation that we wanted to achieve, especially in these darkest areas. So there you go. Sometimes that happens. Okay, so I think he's looking pretty good, all things considered. A little bit of mingling on the surface, but I don't think that's too terrible. I'm also looking to grab a little bit of the blue to kind of fix some of the areas that, I didn't really get right around the edges, kind of like on his claws. He seems to be missing one claw entirely on this foot, which is kind of cool. And he's got an odd number of toes on this side, which I think is entirely appropriate for a troll. Trolls are mentally a bit turgid, and it wouldn't surprise me if there was a little bit of inbreeding going on with these guys, hence the natural range of mutation. Lore-wise, trolls are also quite they're subject to a lot of chaos nonsense. And therefore, just the idea that they might become slightly mutated, it's kind of the norm. Trolls are incredibly tough creatures, so they can tolerate a lot more mutation that might otherwise kill another creature. Lore-wise, I don't think they're considered creatures of chaos. There was a subcategory of creatures that were touched by the power of chaos. So this will include everything from griffins to manticores to chimeras in particular, as well as things like chaos dragons and the like. But trolls, despite the fact that they were chaos trolls, which are a different subspecies that occurred further north, these trolls were not particularly touched by chaos, although you do see weird things like extra toes and odd, inconsistencies of form, all of which kind of made them a little bit more scary and intimidating to look at, I suppose. A little bit more unnatural. So let's clean up the flesh a little bit, because I think I got a little bit overzealous with some of that blue, and a little bit of the flesh tone is kind of lost its luster, so to speak. So I am going to jump in and mix a little bit of a, strange mid-tone with a bit of the Vallejo Silver Grey. This again is the equivalent color for my undercoat. So a little bit of that. And I think I want to put in a little bit of the usual flesh highlight that I use, which is AK's Light Flesh. You could use any equivalent color, to be perfectly honest. There's no reason why you keep to these ranges. I got these because I thought they were really interesting colors. And what we will do is we'll mingle these together to get a nice light color, and then we'll put in a little bit of the blue and a little bit of Guilliman Flesh to get something of a neutral highlight like that. And maybe a little bit more of this. And we can come in with this to clean up some of the areas and give it a quick highlight. So as you get more familiar with my painting style, you'll know that I don't always highlight models, or at least I try to explore other ways of achieving contrast on the surface without necessarily resorting to highlighting immediately. But there are times, I think, when a well-placed highlight or two really does make the surface pop, and therefore you really shouldn't shy away from it in and of itself. Just, I guess, use it judiciously as a technique, because as we all know, highlighting does end up being extremely time consuming, and if I'm to be honest, it actually forms the bulk of my painting time in the past. Nowadays, I think my style has gotten a lot more efficient time-wise, because I'm quite willing to go deeper on the surface with shading washes, successive layers of shading, as opposed to spending a lot of time trying to catch the sharp edges with highlighting. just more the way I prefer to do things these days. So yeah. Still, when the surface is a little bit muddy and hard to read, it's very little to beat a well-placed highlight to sort of draw the eye and to correct maybe little errors of surface geometry that might be caused by the wash or the shading or the contrast paint kind of behaving as it likes to on the surface due to gravity, as opposed to how you would like it to look. So always good to come in and fix this. And really this begins the painter's dance, right? That sort of back and forth between establishing highlights again and glazing them down to make them blend, or to sort of correct overzealous highlighting. And that back and forth really can go on for as long as you like, or for as short as you like, depending on how much mind you put into your painting as you work on it. Like I said before, I tend to do a lot of thinking when I paint, so I try to just go free form, just enjoy the process, let it take as long as it needs to be. These days I no longer do this for armies, but you can sort of see how this more efficient approach to working in layers over a fairly light undercoat can be really efficient and can be really good for army painting. But because I don't do a lot of gaming that's not cooperative these days, I don't really need to rush out armies. There we go. So I think he's starting to look a little bit better, in my opinion. I'm going to jump back in and grab a little bit of that off-white again, and I'm going to sharpen the look of his weapon because I want it to look flinty and dangerous, edgy and sharp. So I'm going to put a little bit of this to define some of the sharp edges. Use a relatively good brush and draw in these sharp points. They're kind of there on the model, to be honest, and it's kind of revealed by our very light non-oil wash, but it just could do with a little bit more emphasis to bring it out a little bit more, just to make the weapon look a little bit sharper and a bit more dangerous. Not really to overtake the model with artificial kind of flakiness. The texture here really kind of emulates the brokenness of flint or granite. Has a little bit of that obsidian vibe, the way it chips and flicks away to create a sharp and dangerous looking weapon. And that we just want to emphasize a little bit with some edge highlights. A little bit more, I think, to draw the eye to the edge. And I think that's starting to look pretty good. So yeah, trolls. Now in terms of points, trolls have always been a little bit expensive, right? The thing about trolls is that they always had that strength 5, toughness 4 kind of stat line. So they were always more damaging than they were damaging on the charge while attacking, and a little bit weaker on the defense compared to, say, ogres, which tended to be a lot cheaper and more numerous. Often ogres of this era had toughness 5, strength 4, so they were kind of a troll reversed. In addition, trolls tended to have a lot of attacks because I think it needed to justify their expense. And the very clear downside of their very low leadership of 4, which I thought was a bit excessive even back in the day. I didn't really play orcs, but I had many friends who did, and just the sheer frustration you would get when they lose the combat by 1 and essentially have no chance of passing a break test to keep fighting. One would imagine that a stupid creature might maybe react more slowly to losing, but no. Trolls were always hair trigger fast on deciding when to flee, and that was a little bit unfortunate because that meant that sometimes you didn't see trolls on the table just because they weren't really a sure bet. It's a shame because trolls are so interesting and so characterful, right? So it really would no one ever complains about seeing trolls on the table, even if they were really overpowered, because trolls are so cool. So to a certain extent, they've kind of addressed this, right, with modern like Age of Sigmar and so on, because I think what they've done is they've made sure that trolls downsides are kind of addressed to some extent, which is a good thing. And therefore, you do see these wonderful creatures lumbering onto the battlefield. Less of that issue of taking them because they were cool, but always regretting it because they didn't really function the way their stat lines would suggest. A bit unfortunate, really. I'm going to clean up the skulls a little bit. Yeah, probably with the same off-white color. Just drop that around the cheekbones first and foremost. And then the eyebrow ridge directly above it. So that establishes the most important place to look. And then after that, I like to come in at the bottom, drop a bit of paint on the edge, the teeth. I find the nose is fine. You don't normally need to emphasize it too much. And then of course that forehead at the top. And then you sort of need to blend the edges in a little bit around it. And there you go. That skull is a lot more defined now. We move on to the claws. Sorry guys, a lot more cleanup on this model because I think just the amount of contrast paint that we use on this giant model, and he's bigger than anything we painted to date so far, right? So I guess I shouldn't be too surprised that he took a lot longer to dry. Yeah, a lot more cleanup on this, but you know what? That's just how it is. And I'm sure a model like a troll, expensive as they are in points, really justifies the extra time and effort. Plus, I mean, look at it, it's a troll. Trolls always earn their place in any army, in my opinion, because trolls are just cool. I just like them a lot. Don't see them as like enough as back in the day, unfortunately, but they were really awesome. So these particular models are iconic because they stayed with us a long time as well. They were essentially really popular and always sold well, to the point where there was a second batch of these trolls, as I mentioned earlier, that had alternate poses that sort of increased the range of variation that you get within the units, which was always nice. So the original 3 were released pretty early on, and then more of them were added later. I've decided this stone could stand to pop out a little bit more, but I still wanted to stay within that kind of cold tone, so I'm using Ethermatic Blue to create something that looks a little bit jade-like. I feel kind of like it, but not too intense. We're going to go back with a little bit more of this noun oil, tone down the highlights a little bit, which I think have kind of run away with the color scheme a little bit. Maybe just a little bit too bright and not respecting the overall geometry as much as I would want. Respecting the geometry. So now that's a phrase that I throw around like it means something, right? When I say respecting the geometry, what I mean is that when we apply paint, we're trying to emphasize what's on the surface, the relief that's already on the surface of the model, the details as you were. So sometimes when the model doesn't have a lot of detail sculpted onto it, you could say that, well, you can't really respect the relief because doing so means that the model looks like it's under detailed. And other times when the model is very textured, to paint it in a way that doesn't emphasize it to the same level as other parts of the models or more, that doesn't respect the relief. So for example, for this weapon, the haft of the weapon is extremely detailed, right? So the idea that you might undershade that, I think, would make it look a little bit odd relative to the rest of the model. So shade those areas boldly to get the point across, I guess is what I'm trying to say. There's a tooth over here. Simple dot of our lighter color would work. I'm trying to get that half cracked tooth. And then on the right side, there is one here as well. I just love how asymmetrical these faces are. You know, they always did have a lot of personality. They always kind of had a bit of a gun going on, and I think that was key to why they were so well received. They always looked like, you know, they had cute expressions on. I need to try to improve that eye. I think it's looking a little bit muddy, so a little bit more Black Templar, which is my go-to for painting black details, because it is strong enough and it is actually not too liquid, unlike a wash, say, or translucent. There we go. I think that looks a lot better. Yeah, I think that looks alright. Again, going in with a little bit more Black Templar where it's needed to redefine the shadows a little bit more. Basically, where, you know, the model kind of recesses a little bit, goes into the shadow. His butt crack, back of the leg, recesses of the muscles, tiny bits that I missed from the beginning, and crevices to make him look properly recessed in the right areas as appropriate. And to essentially become our highlights in reverse. The parts that we don't touch look more like highlights as a result, because we are leaving them close to the original level. So on this model, I've ended up using a lot more black than I intended to. But you know, sometimes that's how it is, the best laid plans, right? And I think it's really up to us to kind of go back and forth on the miniature until we find a finish that we're happy with. Sometimes that means that we change our initial plans, but I'm really liking how he's looking dark and mean and dangerous. Not what you would want to run into in the middle of a game of Warhammer Quest in the deep, dark, craggy dungeons of the old world. Especially if you're a naked troll slayer. Although you would be really happy to run into him, I guess, because that signaled that you might be on the verge of righting a wrong done to your people, especially with these skulls. I wish they had put beards on these skulls. I know that makes absolutely no sense, but I think this is just one of those little areas of like passive storytelling that could have been so much stronger and so much more interesting. I'm liking how dirty and dingy he's looking as well. Doesn't need to come across as clean or washed. He needs to look a little bit ratty and disgusting. And thin coats of black to help define these areas certainly help in that endeavor. I want to clean up a little bit more around his eye because I don't think I've done it justice yet. So let's see. I might actually, you know what, I'm just going to switch to a better brush. I think one challenge I'm facing is also that this brush is a little bit bent. So just a minute, let me reach over and grab a better one. Okay. So let's refine the yellow rim around that pupil. Which I placed higher on the eyeball than on the original sculpt because I thought it looked better. To go back and forth a little bit, position that pupil perfectly where I want it. No, it's happened, guys. Okay, so let's try that again. Let's wash off the paint. Clean and wet brush. Sometimes the model disobeys. Let's try that again with thicker paint. Okay. Just put a tiny dot. A little bit more personality on that eye. But I do believe it needs a little bit more cleaning up, to be honest. Now, you know I was concentrating because I didn't say a word. Well, sometimes that's how it is. Okay, I think I am just about happy with it and the way he looks. Just touching up a little bit of the shading on the wrappings. And I think this troll is ready to roll. Cool, so I'm going to do his base edge now with my favorite base edging color, and that's Scale Colors Brown Leather. As I say in every video, this is an analog for what used to be Scorched Brown or Rhinox Hide today. So let's put that on, tidy up that edge that has got splotches of Agros dunes on it. And I try to do this at the end of every session. I try to, even if I don't finish the miniature, I try to do this at the end of every session because it just feels better to have a model, to come back to a model that's, you know, got this stage done. It looks that much neater and more finished, even if in reality you could do with a lot more work. And it's critical to creating that sense that you've actually achieved something within your one painting session, your one sit down, so that you don't come away feeling like, oh, the model still looks terrible. But here we go, guys. This is our stone troll. There are still things I would tweak about him, but I think for today's session, he's looking plenty good. And I'm finally glad that we broke that threshold of when a model needed a hairdryer session. So okay, guys, enjoy your models. I'll see you in the next one. Let's try maybe something a little bit more interesting, something maybe a stone troll will fight in the next video. Alright guys, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you again in the next video. Have fun, like, comment, subscribe, all the good stuff. Cheers!